Welcome back to the Lords of Lore podcast. I'm Matt.
I'm Luka.
I'm Rubar.
Rubar, welcome to the main show.
What's good,
The
man?
boy himself, the king, the young prince,
Thank you.
Mr. Handsome, got a fresh cut, so he needed to come on the show.
I missed
Nice.
So we
Only
are
reason why I
without
said
our
yes,
Yeah, caught him at the right time.
Did you
We
get
are
the cut
without
format?
our
Yeah, I
wondrous
did.
Wiseman Will today. So we have another guest on the show. And what better guest to have than the king himself?
I will never replace Will.
It's tough to
Like
do,
I will
but
never.
we're glad to have you here. Anyway.
Thank you.
What's your wondrous wisdom going to be on today?
My wondrous wisdom.
Yeah, he's full of it apparently.
I don't know. We'll see where the conversation takes me.
Great.
I'll
For
leave
people
it
watching,
open-ended.
if you didn't see, last Friday we released an episode of Unabashed on Pokemon with Ethan Snowden. That's probably the longest episode of Unabashed thus far. So check that one out. It was really fun. This Friday you can catch us playing Dungeons and Dragons. Luka, Will, and I will be back for that. So you can catch that this coming Friday as we continue our adventure in Ryandel with fantastic DM and guest you saw last week, Cam Chapman. And then remember, the book of the month for October for Luka and I's rumination is The Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, which I've started. I'm almost halfway through. It's pretty good. It's pretty great.
Oh, wow. You're way ahead of me.
Where are you?
Like on page 1.
Recommends it and doesn't even read it.
Yeah. I mean, to
Yeah.
be fair, I've had it for like 6 months and I haven't opened it once.
I'll be honest, I was super not excited to start it just based off like the back.
Yeah.
I was like, oh man. It's like, and I talked about this on the show a couple weeks ago, and you actually coached me through it. But I am here to say the world building is actually pretty cool.
Cool.
And I can't wait to talk about it. So if people want to read along with us, that's the book we're doing. So as always, before
Just have
we
an
get
entire episode where you read to your listeners.
yeah, can you imagine?
So
Okay.
chapter 1.
Read along.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So you guys can find us on Twitch at Lords of Lore, where I will read the book live to you. Anyways, today we're going to be talking about fiction versus fantasy, the differences between, why we are more inclined to one or the other, and just our general feelings about the two genres or approaches to said genre. So yeah, I can't wait to get into that. But before we do that, we'll start with our regular scheduled segments here. Beginning first with Luka's Litany of Literature, wherein Luka has the podcast within the podcast, talks a little bit of what's going on in his life. So what's up, buddy?
I've been slacking. I haven't started Ninth House because I don't have it in audiobook form. I have it in the physical book. So I've been kind of busy for the last week since we filmed the Bone Shard Daughter. So just I haven't had the time to sit down and start reading it. And like, it's already almost October, so I need to get on it quick. I have been re-listening to parts of The Sword of Kaigen, just because we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, and then I was thinking about it, so I re-listened to it. I re-listened to some of the Goblin Emperor because you sent me
Yes.
the picture of the cover of the like spiritual sequel, The Witness for the Dead, which I'm super excited to read. We will ruminate on both of those books because I have to say that for me, The Goblin Emperor is one of the works that is like closest to perfect that I've ever read, watched, listened to. So I love it. That's why I keep re-listening to it constantly.
What is it?
It's called The Goblin Emperor.
The Goblin
Like
Emperor.
Catherine.
By Catherine Addison, I think.
Addison. Okay.
I think. It is just a fantastic standalone fantasy novel. And honestly, like, I wouldn't even recommend it to anybody. Yeah, Catherine Addison. Sorry, I was looking up who the author was.
It's perfect, but I wouldn't recommend it to anybody.
I didn't even realize where I stopped talking. I was gonna say I wouldn't recommend it to anybody who isn't like super hardcore into fantasy because it's so it has no action and it has no real, like, it's all political intrigue and like following
but I think that's the coolest thing. It's like
exactly
you
like
don't have to draw people in because it's some action figures beating each other's up, you know? Like,
yeah, exactly. It has some of the best world building I've ever seen in my life. Like, and it's so good because she doesn't even dive deep into it. It just like gives you these nuggets of world building, and just like such a satisfying way of doing world building. And speaking of that, I'm hoping that the ninth house is very similar because it since it takes place in Yale, I guess, like obviously it reminds me immediately of Harry Potter, like a school for fantasy in our world,
like
and
Yale University, right?
Yeah.
It's so like it's weird because it's like it's one of those things again that I'm initially not very into, where it's like the secret world beneath the the mortal realm, and there's all this fantasy stuff going on, but the stuff they do is so like the magic system and the I don't want to give too much away, but like the houses, the organizations that perform different types of magic are so interesting and like brutal that like it very much feels like with a little sugar sprinkled on top, this is something that could actually, hypothetically be a reality.
Be real. Yeah.
So
but I love that though.
Yeah.
Like my background, like Avatar: The Last Airbender, like so many of the politics, like so much of the entire series isn't even about the action. It's more so about like the politics that run from city to city and stuff, town to town. That's what I loved about the show, actually.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
How realistic everything is.
I want to get into that like in the main topic and why fantasy is so good at doing that. But yeah, no, Ninth House is super cool the way it handles that. And there's also like references to like obviously real world things, but real world events that have happened. They get attributed to like this magic system.
Okay,
and it's like
cool.
It's super fucking like it's very much like Assassin's Creed in that way, where it's like, oh, that thing you were taught, it was actually because of fucking assassins and magic. It's like, okay, but like this one feels a little bit more earned, and the main character is really this is just a minor spoiler, but they can see ghosts, and ghosts are sort of all around, but to see them you have to like ingest this like special concoction, but she just sees them. And like there's a central sort of narrative that keeps going back to in the book is like this one person who asks her like, when was the first time you knew or you saw them, and it gets like revealed that like it's just been her whole life, and like there was a certain point in time where she didn't know they weren't real. So like things happen to her and people think she's crazy, but like those things really happen to her. It's pretty sad.
Cool.
A lot of it.
I like
that. Sounds deep, man.
Yeah, it's honestly like I was blown away. Again, like never a book I would have read the back of and been like, yeah, I'm taking this one home.
Yep.
I would have been like, oh, corny. But I fucking, maybe this is a growing thing for me because I was totally wrong. So
yeah. No, that's, I mean, but like that's a beauty of it. Like fantasy isn't just like all this crazy anime stuff, or like, like there's actual real feelings that come with it. And like
that's why I love the Goblin Emperor so much, because it's the character work that builds the story, and then like the fantasy elements are just like the small little pieces of world building, and the fact that they're elves and goblins instead of humans. But like everything else is just like the human narrative that you can relate to, like the characters that are well developed.
Almost more than real life. It's weird.
Exactly.
Or like almost more than like real movies and stuff. Like when the Avatar, like when the Last Airbender ended, like I was like, oh fuck, like a part of me is like missing, like, like it's weird. It's weird how relatable certain things are. Yeah. I don't want to tap into that until Matt gets to it. I don't want to go too deep,
No, this is good. I'm glad.
Into deep. Yeah.
So that will do it for the entry into the litany. Matthew, you can take it away with
So hang on, sorry. I had all these wild filters on my face before and just realized my lips were purple.
Okay, I was gonna ask, are you wearing lipstick?
I was like, man, my lighting is super weird today. Like, why? And then I realized when I put my hand to it like went away. So it's like, this is because I was messed around. Anyways, not Matt's monster musings this week. Again, we're going to go with Matt's meandrous mumblings. And so, Luka, I had mentioned in last week's show that I wanted to grill you about something.
Yes.
But I'm gonna leave that maybe until next week.
Oh my god, I need to know, man. I've been waiting.
How to be here for it? What do you mean?
Yeah, well, maybe I don't think actually it'll take up that much time, so I'll just do it right now.
Cool.
So, for people who don't know, Luka and I did a book review of The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart, a book which we both loved, and it has a lot of plot twists and reveals at the end. So I'm gonna just issue a quick spoiler warning. If you're still making your way through that book or intend to read it in the future, come back in like 2 minutes. Sorry, Rubar, I'm gonna spoil this book for you, but so I'll try to be as cryptic as possible so people who have read it will know what I'm talking about, but if you haven't, you probably won't know. So the character that is Lynn's father at the end is revealed to have alternate vessel, I'll say. Yes. Okay, which we both agreed in our review was very cool and sort of brought forward some ideas that might get brought to the forefront in the sequels. What does that mean? Can that be activated, that vessel? But that reminded me while I was doing the review for Star Wars Visions, in the reveal we get in episode 9, where Snoke is essentially that to Palpatine, an alternate vessel. And we see there's things in vats floating around that are that same thing. So I know how you feel about that already. And I feel similar to the way you feel about it. But these two things being very similar to me, I was sort of like, so on one hand, Luka really likes it in this medium, but in this one, you like absolutely detest it. So I said grill you, but I agree. Like I have the same feelings, but I'm just wondering because you coached me through my meanders mumbling 2 weeks ago. What do you think the quantitative or qualitative difference actually is between those two character choices?
I mean, for one, I think the fact that Snoke was set up as like a brand new character just to like 180 reverse, and it's like, oh, it's Palpatine again. Lazy, no planning. You have endless budget, endless time with one of the most popular properties that exist, and this is what you think of? Like, it's embarrassing. It's irredeemable. Like, there's no. That's why I called it irredeemable trash, because it is like all of these years of planning, and you can't even prepare a 1, 2, 3 trilogy like that actually makes sense together. That trilogy has nothing. Like, it's not a trilogy. It's 3 garbage movies that make no sense together. Like, there's no character development. There's no growth. There's no arcs. There's nothing. There's nothing of worth in any of those films except for the special effects and the soundtracks. Whereas
that just ruins everything, huh?
Yeah, it was terrible.
I can't say I agree with you, but in no way, shape, or form can I actually admit that you're at all wrong.
Like, I understand people that enjoyed the films. Like, they were enjoyable films, surface level, but they're not good movies. Like if that is the quality we can expect from the Star Wars IP, just let it die. Like, I don't want to see any more. That literally, like, I don't want to see it. Like, think of something new then. Whereas in the Bone Shard Daughter, like, that's not the case, because first of all, we don't even know what's going to happen with that vessel. Like, there's no explanation. We don't know why the other creature was in the vessel. We don't understand, like, if it's even possible to do what you're talking about, because the original vessel is whatever happened to it at the end is what happened. Right. And it seemed final. So it's like, and for that, it was like a reveal, like we knew that those experiments were happening in the basement at a certain point, and we knew there was some secrecy, but there was never like a direct, like, that was like a big reveal at the end in like this fantasy sort of world that like her father character was like doing these things. So it's like we don't even know what's going to happen with that. So it's like it's not like a brand new idea. It's not a mind-blowing like original idea or anything, but it's interesting, and it, depending on how it's used in book 2 will like affect my opinion on it, because like that reveal specifically, I didn't love it, I didn't hate it. I was like, okay, that's interesting. Like I wonder where this is going. Like it set up more questions that come with exactly.
Interesting. Okay.
Whereas in Star Wars, it was like we need to save ourselves from poorly performing movies, so let's just bring back something people like, and let's like force it to happen that way. Because I'm pretty sure in Star Wars the vessels aren't shown until episode 9, correct?
That's correct.
So, and he dies, and Snoke dies in episode 8.
Yeah.
In like the stupidest way possible. So like that was like clearly like a retrospective, like, all right, how do we fix this? Like, let's just shoehorn Palpatine back into this series.
I agree, but I mean, it's obviously like, because we have so much information on the background, how this trilogy was made, it's you can't argue that it was shoehorned, because they really had no idea what they were doing. Yeah. So what I really wanted to talk about today, sort of related to this, I wanted to talk about when the decision is made to adapt something or create either an on-screen adaptation of something, whether that's TV or film. And the question I really want to ask is, does the ending always matter? So this sort of has to relate with Star Wars, obviously, in that, like you said, people do enjoy those movies. Whether there was a through line or not, or it was just flying by the seat of their pants, which we know they were still movies that got made and were successful by any metric. Mm-hmm. They all have high critic scores, and they all have, financial success that's, only rivaled by maybe like the Marvel movies. So there's that. They're successful. Mm-hmm. But, by fans, they're not as adored as previous entries in that franchise are. But what I really am interested in is, let's talk about Game of Thrones, which we bring up a lot. Mm-hmm. Luka, we know your feelings. Okay, well, I'm interested in yours as well, Rubar. But we know, Luka, your feelings towards the back half of the series, mm-hmm. Especially the final, I think, 3 seasons.
2 definitely, 3.
2 definitely.
Okay. So yeah. I always say, why did they begin adapting Game of Thrones before they knew how it ended? And the response is always, well, they thought it would have ended in time, but they didn't know.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. But then I thought a lot of things get started to be adapted before they're finished. Harry Potter is another example. And then we have the classic examples where that's not the case. Things like Lord of the Rings, the Wheel of Time adaptation that's coming out. Those are completed series. And so there are people out there who have read those properties who know how they end. So I guess I'm struggling to see like when it's not a good idea to adapt something based off the ending. But that made me think, does the ending matter? Because every time we read a book for our rumination, Luka, we go, I would love to see this as a series. And most of the books we read, with I think the exception of Sword of Kaigen, are not like singular self-contained stories.
Yeah.
But every entry into a series sort of is a self-contained story. So I'm just wondering what you guys' thoughts are. Does the ending of a series on screen actually matter, or is the journey of how to get there more important? If we have 5 or 4 good seasons of Game of Thrones, do the last 2 or 3 really discredit everything we've got up to there? And, if we have 6 or 3 debatable good movies of Star Wars, do the next 3 matter? I know how I feel about it, but Rubar, what are your thoughts?
For me, it's almost like writing a really good essay and not having a conclusion, and you're just leaving it open-ended. And it's like, or it's not what you expected. So like you write an entire essay about your topic or whatever, and then you have to like finalize it and like kind of recollect everything and put closure to it. And if you don't deliver on that, it almost discredits your essay as well, like your body paragraphs kind of thing. So I do think it all ties in together. It definitely changes my perspective on the series before, like the seasons before and stuff. To say Game of Thrones is now a shit TV show or because of the ending and stuff, no. Like I could rewatch the first 6 seasons and just restart and still like love it as much kind of thing. But I like deep down in the back of my mind, I'm like, they could have done so much better. Like it's just angering to an extent where I'm like all they had to do was just like watch it before they released it, and they would have realized how bad it would have been and like how rushed it felt kind of thing. It's like, if the producers were rushed to finish it, like, am I over romanticizing my love for this TV show?
You know? I see. Like the love that you have for it, you feel was not reciprocated on the creator's end.
Yeah, like,
yeah, fair enough.
Like if I mean, obviously you have to love the plot and like as a producer of it, hopefully they love it more than I do or more than anybody does, you know? But it, like the last 2 seasons, it almost felt like they were tired of it and they were like, let's just put an end to it and hope for the best. And that's kind of discredits the producers and stuff, but it doesn't take away from the show for me. Definitely not up to the 5-6 seasons that were really good.
Mm-hmm.
Just like The Office, like when Michael Scott left, it like kind of died down. So even when I rewatch The Office, it's like season 1 to 7 restart, season 1 to 7 restart.
So yeah, okay, here's the thing, I do the exact same thing. I've never seen any Office material where Michael's like, I think I've seen like where Will Ferrell comes in and then
season 7,
I think,
or season 7
Jim becomes the boss for a while, and then I stop watching and I start from the beginning. So I don't have the same feel. Like I very much live in this false reality where that is the only storyline. I've never finished it. And anytime I attempt to, I just get like bored and then I stop watching it and then I go, I should start watching The Office again and start like I'm into this weird fucking feedback loop.
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm at with it as well. And like same with like Game of Thrones and stuff. Like if I were to rewatch it, like I think I would just stop at season 6 or wherever there was, and just kind of like let my fantasy make the ending for me and just restart the thing kind of thing.
Wow.
So like even in The Office, like even when Michael's not there, it almost feels like he's there right now for me. Even like rewatching it, it's like like I create these like different little like settings that he'd be in kind of thing. So no, I definitely does affect the series, like a show or a movie with a great ending, like even like Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I mean, I think
the
like
Return
for
of the
Game
King,
of Thrones, yeah, of course, like great ending, but like for Game of Thrones,
of closure.
Yeah, exactly.
I just felt like when TV shows or movies miss that closure, it's like you're not satisfied with the entire series. It almost feels unfinished or like.
But sometimes it feels like that's the point.
Yeah, but like, with Game of Thrones, it so clearly isn't.
Yeah, for Game of Thrones, they really went
so
for
clearly isn't. That's the issue.
You know,
Return
like
of the
issue
finish.
The issue with Game of Thrones is like, it's so obvious when they lose the source material because the writing just goes from like some of the best TV ever made to just average, like watchable, average, kind of entertaining. Like, do you guys remember how much dialogue there was in seasons 1 through 4? Like there was
way
no
too much
action.
Like you'd have to write down notes to be able to keep up.
Like there was just constant conversation. Like every scene was like conversation, building the world, like the dynamic between the characters, to get to like season 6 and 7 where it was just like, oh, here's a moment. They're just like hitting you with like, oh, this is like Jon Snow reuniting with Arya. Like, okay, now let's move on. Like it just it honestly felt like contemptuously written. Like like it was just, there was just no respect for the source material. Like they took zero risks. And that's the ending. It was just, and then again, like I still haven't rewatched Game of Thrones. Like I've not gone back to rewatch it because there's no point.
Same.
Like I'll watch.
See, that's my thing though, is because let's say Game of Thrones completely shut down operations after they lost the source material and waited. Do you think you would have rewatched it then? Like, would you do like, let's say it took 10 years for him to finish writing and they paused all production. This would never happen, by the way. But let's just say in this, fantasy world that did happen. Would your feelings towards it be different, or would you still be like, the ending is not resolved, so I don't want to watch it?
Personally, no. Like, I think I would rewatch it more if the ending wasn't there.
Me too.
Because I think I'm like angered towards the fact that, because now there is a conclusion to it, and it was
the one that's not satisfying,
and it was so ass. Yeah. Like, they could have ended it on season 6, like, without actually finishing the show, and I think it would have been better. And then we could have
they could have literally ended it where Jon Snow died.
We would have been more angry at the fact that it wasn't fit, or we wouldn't have been as angry at the point that they didn't finish the series than finishing it wrong, kind of thing.
Oh wow, that's interesting, because you guys know, like, The Sopranos. I've never actually seen the show, but the ending of it is sort of infamous in that it sort of just cuts mid conversation. You don't really get to see what happens. And I know, like, the following year since it's come out, people have sort of been more open to that idea of being like, we had like a very small window into this person's life, and then the window closed, and that's the end. So I sort of feel that way, where, like you're saying, if they would have just like stopped it, right, it may, like, you may be angry that it never resumed, but you still get to keep that happy little, 4 to 5 seasons.
That those respectable moments where you're like, oh, they didn't ruin the show. They just stopped it.
I guess it's sort of like a relationship, right? Like, if your relationship ends poorly, you don't look back with fond memories on the good times. You just go, I can't believe that person hurt me in this way.
Yeah, right? every time they didn't do something for you, or all the negatives come up.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're like, oh, fucking idiot. She wasn't even a good cleaner. She smiled weird.
Yeah, no, but I think it's weird, like, to contextualize it that way, but it really is like a relationship you have with this thing you're consuming all the time. So when it ends poorly, I guess it's fair to be like, I can't look at the beginning the same anymore. Like, it's all.
But there's also, like, why did it end poorly? Like, you can go back and listen to the interviews of the two producers, like Dan, or like D&D, like those guys. Like, they, like, when you listen to them talk about, it's like, it's insulting. Like there's like that interview where it's like, oh, like, the scene where they said, like, oh, Danny forgot about the entire Iron Fleet. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you're actually gonna write this and then say that out loud? Like, what do you like, why? Yeah. And then they lost Star Wars, because, like, that's why they tried to wrap it up, because they wanted to do Star Wars.
Yeah.
And then, do you know what the next film they made after? It was Gemini Man, another garbage film.
Oh, are they involved in that?
Yeah, they were the producers of Gemini Man.
Oh.
Like, it just, like, if had they been, like, very open about, like, the difficulty of writing this and being like, we're trying to wrap this series that a lot of people love in, like, a respectable way, and then, like, sure, if it missed a bit, like, if you had seen the fact that they're actually trying to, like, do it justice, they're like, we don't have source material, we need to finish the series, like, we're gonna do our best to, like, keep the energy of the show up until, like, this point.
So here's one thing, though, is because I think at first, like, season 5, they definitely were, like, I think that was their approach, but I think they were getting such pushback from George on, providing them with what was next, because he was, I might be messing a little bit of the timeline up, but he was sort of adamant in that he wanted to finish the book, but he wasn't doing it at the timeline they had initially thought. And since then, he's actually, put the books on hiatus again and said he's working on other Game of Thrones adaptation series. I can't remember what they're called, but they're basically to deal with I think the House of the Dragon deals with, like, the Targaryens.
Deal with all the information that they missed in the TV show. They're like, he's like, let me just clear shit up with these tangents.
But, like, he was very, he pushed back against them getting the information they needed. And so it came to a certain point where they were sort of just on their own. And at that point, I think, is where they sort of got frustrated and were like, we want to be done with this. because this is not what we signed up for, and we feel like we're being set up to fail, essentially, as he sort of left them on the line. And they're not writers, like at least as far as I know, they're producers, right? They're showrunners. So I think for them it was sort of like, we'll do the best we can, but like this is not what we signed up for, so you'll get what you get, type of thing.
I get that, like, and I don't know the details of like how much information he was willing to give them or not. Like, I get even from his perspective not wanting to tell them what his idea for the ending is because he wants to put it in a book first.
I was gonna say, like, I think I have like a theory that he still wants the books to do really well, and that's why he like.
I mean, if he even releases the books ever, like
before he fucking dies.
I think, yeah.
Like,
now he has the benefit of being like, okay, that didn't work in the show. If you do something else.
But I mean, there's no way that anything that happened in the show was his idea. Like that's not his like it's such weak writing. Like honestly, like the moments were so weak. Like what? Like, can you remember any impactful moment of the entire season 8? Like the entire finale? Like I can't remember a single moment that hit hard.
I think the last episode is fine.
No, it isn't. It's terrible. Like the conclusion.
Disagree. But
how are you gonna make Braun the what is it, the Minister of Coin? Like
those no
like that, like those kinds of like contemptuous decisions, you know, like that's what I'm talking about. Like,
no, you're right.
So like I honestly can't think of a single moment that like hit hard. I really can't. I can't think of a single moment that stayed with me other than being like, wow, that was really stupid.
Yeah, I think like the last season just turned into like greatest hits, like,
but like not even greatest hits. Like what was a great hit? Like
it was sort of like fan service in the way that's like, we want all these cool things to happen, but they sort of didn't earn them.
But like, what cool things
Arya will
happened?
kill the Night Lord, and like, but that was it.
That's
like,
not her arc even. Like
I know, yeah.
Like that's not even her arc. Why would she be the one to kill him? And like, why are you gonna build this villain up all this time to end it in a second? Be like, okay, well now what? And then it's like, okay, now it's Cersei, and then she dies by rocks. Like, okay, cool.
Like, I think the only satisfying. The only satisfying was when the Hound fought the Mountain.
Yeah, that was but even that felt like a Marvel movie more than Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Like, do you remember Oberyn Tyrell?
That was probably the only part where I was like, okay, they actually like went for it. Like I did want to see this, but like,
yeah, you're right. You're right. But like,
I don't think they delivered on the scene itself. I think it was more so delivered on the actual plot being delivered. You know,
exactly. So, we've been waiting for that confrontation. Yeah. But it still didn't feel like as impactful. Like, do you remember Oberyn versus the Mountain?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like that was like an entire episode of just
exactly.
Like, yeah.
Like those, like you remember Joffrey's death, you remember the Red Wedding, you remember Jon Snow being stabbed by the Night's Watch. Like these are the moments you remember.
And fucking Arya goes through this entire training of becoming a faceless little idiot.
Yeah.
Just to fucking show up in the last 5 seconds and use it and then be done with it. I'm like you guys spent like 2 seasons literally haunting our feelings to see what's gonna happen with this girl. She turned into this fucking insane person just to be put in a 5-second scene. Like not even kill what's his name?
The Night King.
No, it wasn't even that. No, she didn't. She wasn't even faceless for that.
The guy, the Bridge Lord guy.
The Red Wedding guy.
Yeah, the phrase.
Yeah, Walter Frey.
Yeah. They just literally put that in that scene, and that's all she trained for, was to kill that guy and dress as his little maid and be done with it, and just never use it again.
So it's like, okay.
When she went to go kill the
Night King.
What's his name? Yeah, the Night King. I was like, oh, she's gonna like turn into one of them, you know? Like she's gonna be like I was looking to his sides. I was like, is there like a different movement, like a different like facial expression? I was like, one of them has to be Arya. And all I see is her fucking jumping off the roof. And I'm like, so she trained for literally like 5 seconds of a scene.
I guess she does the faceless thing against Littlefinger as well, though, right? That's part of that arc.
No, Littlefinger's executed in front of her without a her normal face.
Oh, but yeah, never mind. Sansa discovers she has like masks in her suitcase or something.
Yeah.
Anyway,
something
okay, hang
like
on.
that.
Let's reel it in. So we have all our feelings about Game of Thrones. I'm going to retract what I said a bit. I don't think the last episode's fine, but there's parts of it that I did enjoy. And then Luka, we watched it together actually, and I think you remember my reaction was mostly like, "What the fuck?"
Yeah.
But since living with it for years now, I'm not as angry about it. I've sort of like let it breathe, and I think at some point I might rewatch the last season just to confirm my feelings about it. However, bringing this back into the topic here, is it wrong then for us to say things like, I would love to see this first book of this trilogy as an adaptation? If I don't know how it ends, I can't be sure that it won't upset me, and I'm setting myself up for failure by manifesting it into the world. Is that a rational thing that people should think, or am I insane?
No, I think you're right, because you have the issue of, look, the reason Game of Thrones had to end was because of like the logistics of filming a TV show. Like they needed the contracts, they needed the actors to be free, they needed all these things to be set up. Plus, I mean, to be fair, George Martin was releasing books every 2 years when they started. And then like all of a sudden it's been like 13, 14 years and he hasn't released a single. I mean, that's not true. He's released books. He released an entire trilogy of Game of Thrones novels just about the Targaryens, like in that same time. Honestly, I think he's scared to finish them. I don't think he knows how he wants to end them. Like I've heard a couple of interviews of him talking about like how this project has sort of ballooned beyond his original expectations. And I don't know that he even has an ending in his head. Like, because he said, in 2019, he said that if the Winds of Winter isn't out by June 2020, like his fans can like lock him up in a cabin until he finishes it. Like that was like a quote he said, like, I'll be ready by like June 2020. It's like it's October 2021. And there's not even like well, exactly. The pandemic was a perfect time to be writing
theories on how the pandemic would end.
So
that's a very good point.
For example, Matt, we love the Rage of Dragons and the Burning series. Correct. It's a planned 4 novels. I would not want to see an adaptation started until at least the 3rd one is out.
Right.
Like until it's like 3rd one's out, we know the 4th is coming out in like 2 years or whatever it might be. And like now you start it. So like we'll have 2-3 years of show or movies coming out with like actors locked into contracts. By the time those are done, 4th book is out, series is over, and they can just adapt it. But then like having an ending to a series isn't a guarantee of a good adaptation. Also,
that's very true. 100%. Like even like Aragon. Yeah. But I just like, I think having no ending is another way it can go wrong. Yeah. Like I can't remember who said this, but something that's repeated often in Hollywood is a movie is trying to be bad at every step of the way. And it's your job as the filmmakers to make it not bad. Like it is actively trying to be, and your only job is to make sure that it doesn't succeed. And I think that is just giving a big way that it can make itself bad, as if you don't know how it ends. So you're setting up all these things that should play as foreshadowing, should be callbacks when you realize how the ending happens, should be, oh, I should have realized. And then on subsequent viewing of the film, you're like, this is a beautiful way that they put this all together without, spelling it out to you. But when you don't have an ending, you don't know to put those things in. And so when you get to the ending, it was like, well, that came out of fucking nowhere. Why is Bran the king? Like, it doesn't really make sense. Like, but
honestly, like what they did with the ending with all the roles and all of that didn't really bother me. Like, it made sense that Jon Snow was going to go back to the wall and blah blah blah. It's more so they set themselves up with all these conversations and these little tangents that they went in from season 1 to 6 that they never tapped into in season 7 and 8. It's like a lot of those stories just died down or just never were even like mentioned, and it just left certain parts open-ended, or like not even open-ended, just unfinished, and then finished the series off. I'm like, you guys could have done it, and they had the option to make it longer. That's what pisses me off.
Yeah,
like,
HBO
they had the option. They're
them.
like, HBO offered them 12 episodes, and they're like, well, we'll do it in like 7 or 8 or whatever.
Yeah, it was 7 episodes, I think.
And it's like, oh, like you guys could have actually like tapped into each conversation and been like, sure, it'll feel rushed, but at least there's some closure to every part of it. Whereas like they're like, oh, now it's just done, and like everybody is happy. And yeah, this entire season, this entire episode on one conversation just dissipated into nothing because we decided to rush it. Like they could have even been like, okay, this led to this, or like this conversation ended like this. What's that bald guy's name? I haven't even looked into Game of Thrones. Yeah, like Varys' entire story was just like ignored. It was just like rushed
abruptly.
Yeah, and I was just like, what? Like the guy had a finger in literally every single scene and every single setting, and he just became a little nobody at the end.
Like I think my sort of feelings again towards that last season is more so the execution fails. I think all the places the characters end up, with the exception of Bronn being the master of coin, that's just dumb. But where all the other characters end up, I'm mostly okay with. There's none of them where I was like, that was a dumb decision. I just wish they had more time to explain and, you know, sort of hint towards why that could be. Like,
not just show Jon Snow for 5 seconds going towards the wall.
I think it would have been better to show like Jon Snow coming back into the world in King's Landing, in Winterfell and everywhere, and feeling like an outsider. That would have made sense by the end of the season why he returns. Not like just because he's killed Daenerys.
To why they ended up going there. Not just being like, okay, so here we're gonna spawn him in fucking
and then Varys makes sense. Like you say, you had a hand in everything, but like eventually you can't. There's no more cards left to play, and so he loses. That makes sense. Like to say out loud makes sense, but like the way
it doesn't. That's not how he ended. He ended just by being like, he questioned Daenerys and she executes him. Like that's not like, the thing is, none of the characters are themselves anymore. Like the story itself doesn't feel like a Song of Ice and Fire at all. Like seasons 1 through 5 are grimdark. Yeah. Like when the show started, everybody's like, yeah, Ned's going to be king. Nah, he's going to get his head chopped off at the end of season 1. Like his story is over. Like that's what Game of Thrones was. And now it's like, oh, so Jon Snow survives. Like all the main characters. How is Bronn going to survive? Come on. Like, like how are all these people like having happy endings?
I mean, the little kid in me was happy that nobody died, obviously. But that's all Game of Thrones. That's all what Game of Thrones was built on.
Right.
Like,
but I think to be honest,
anymore.
I think they tapped into a big enough crowd where they're like we might have to like lay off the dark shit and like make people happy.
No, I think when there was still the source material, they could go off the source material, which, like you're saying, Luca, was grimdark. But then when they ran out of that, it was like, how do we make a modern story? Well, what does Marvel do? Like, not to say like they copied Marvel, but like that is very modern storytelling in that everything works out in the end and everyone leaves.
Please everybody kind of thing.
That's why it's not satisfying, because that's not Game of Thrones. Like that's not the story they started to tell.
That wasn't why people fell in love with the show. It was like,
that's why I'm saying it's so contemptuously written, because it doesn't respect what it was. Like it doesn't respect the source material or the characters or the people who put doesn't respect the actors who created those characters, like brought them to life. It doesn't respect anybody. Like
I wouldn't say it's contempt. I would say it's like the showrunners and producers weren't aware of why the show was successful. Or at least their interpretation of it was different. It was like, oh, this, no one's ever done a period fantasy series that's been this successful. This is why people love it. It's Lord of the Rings as a TV show, and it's not. It was very much not a fantasy TV show. The fantasy aspect of it was strictly setting, and everything else was like a political thriller, or it was more to do with the characters. Like the setting was sort of, it just took the background. Nothing really magical happens in the show apart from the children of the forest and Bran. I don't know. I just think they didn't know what they had. And I think it's the same thing we were talking about with Star Wars. When you have people who are running it, who aren't passionate about it, they can't really quantify what actually makes this successful. So they just go, you like Chewbacca, right? And you like Han Solo, and you like Luke, and you like Leia. Like, here they are again. Oh, you like the Empire and Death Stars, right? Here we go. It's like, yeah, but not quite. We don't want the same thing over and over. And I think at the end of Game of Thrones, they were just like, yeah, you like this period piece, right? And you like people killing each other? Well, here they all are.
But even that, it wasn't like they shied away from
characters to survive, because now we have the show is so popular, we have to tap into like everybody's feelings and make sure that they're not upset about Arya dying. I was like, either Arya's dying or Jon Snow. Like one of them has to die.
They both should have died.
Yeah, and they're here holding hands, walking to fucking Winterfell together. I'm just like, what? Like, exactly. How does that make sense?
But that's what I mean when I say contemptuous. Like they didn't take into consideration what they were making, like what the story is, what the source material is.
From literally episode 1, Arya and Jon Snow were separated, and there were so many times where they almost met and it never worked out. And then they're meeting in fucking season 7 or 8 or whatever it was. I don't even fully remember how they met, to be honest. I just remember being like, it wasn't
a moment. Like it was just like,
I just remember being like, that's it. I imagined them like bawling, like hitting each other of like the emotions, because like that was her guy. Like, you know, like they were, the first episode he taught her how to like shoot a bow and shit. Like their interaction was just like such a letdown. And I was like, wow, like I'm more emotional than they are. Mm-hmm. Like here, like I was anticipating way more. Like maybe that's a fault on me or like on us, kind of thing. Because maybe
it's on them because they didn't live up to the moments.
They didn't deliver.
And it was also cowardly written because they didn't take a single risk. Like there was nothing. There's no major moments. And then like even the one sort of like major character death, like Miss Sande being killed. Like the way that happened is like a far shot, and then like as soon as like the sword swings, we cut away to Grey Worm's reaction. Like that's not Game of Thrones. We saw Oberyn Tyrell's head get smashed, and then his wife go, ah! Like do you remember? Like that was Game of Thrones.
That's grimdark. That's brutalist, and that's
exactly, real. And that's what that story was supposed to be.
I can see what you're saying. So I think from this conversation, I have learned the endings do matter. And maybe but also I still sort of hold true to that idea that like it's not always the destination, it's the journey. But when the destination fucking sucks, it makes the journey kind of a headache as well. You might not take the journey again. And that's fair, I think.
Oh, and speaking of bad journeys, Star Wars Episode 9 was bad from start to finish.
Oh, well, okay.
We'll have to save that for another day, sure. But like, like I watched that movie in theaters and I was like the whole time I was just like head shaking. I was like, wow, this is just garbage. I hate this so much.
I'm excited to get into that at some point because I disagree, but I see where you're coming from.
And when we decide to do it, I will rewatch it and I will take copious notes.
Oh, okay. We can.
I will watch it for the first time and I'll be in the comment box.
So let's get into our main topic here, which we've broached quite a bit in both of these opening segments. But again, we're talking about fiction versus fantasy. So Luka, when we were talking about this topic, it was sort of the difference between science fiction and fantasy, which I'll say now I think are not different at all. Mm-hmm. I think there's elements that are at play in both, and then we get sometimes things like Star Wars, which is a mixture. We'll get into that in a second, but more so, I was sort of inspired to do this topic from two events that happened recently. So one, I saw my friend tweet something that nonfiction is a study of humanity and fiction is a study of the human soul. Something along those lines. I'm paraphrasing. Yeah. And I was like, that's a beautiful way to look at it. So I was inspired by that. But then also a conversation I had with my girlfriend who was reading this book called The Song of Achilles. It's based on Greek myth. So in the story, there's things like centaurs that speak and interact with characters, sphinxes, all that good stuff. Magic, godly powers. But this book was actually in the fiction section of the bookstore chapters that we went to. Whereas I spend most of my time in the bookstore in the fantasy section because I am drawn more towards fantasy sci-fi. And my girlfriend spends most of her time in the fiction section, but avoids things like, I don't know, like Jane Austen novels and that sort of real world fiction. She's not really into as much as she is fantastical fictions, or what I would just call fantasy. But it made me wonder. So I asked her, like, why aren't you in the fantasy section? She was like, oh, I like things that are like, you know, sort of magical and like not really real and stuff like that. And I was like, yeah, that's fantasy. She was like, not really though. And I was like, I think And then she was explaining to me like what she liked. And I was like, I can see how these two things are different in your perspective. I was like, but maybe they just put that book in the fiction section because they thought it would sell better because more adults probably go to the fiction than the fantasy section.
Yeah.
And I think that's shitty. That kind of sucks. Or maybe it's because it's based off Greek myth, which is a real thing. But the stories, I don't know. So I did some research. And a lot of what gets called fantasy is fiction with these magical elements that has an author. Okay, so that's one of the important distinctions. The author is known to us. So the Lord of the Rings is fantasy because we know J.R. Tolkien was a person who existed. We have it that this was a fantasy. But something like Norse mythology wouldn't be considered fantasy. You would find that in the fiction section or in the historic section because we don't know who wrote those. And they are, at this point now, historical documents and storytelling. So you could find those in the nonfiction section as well, even though there's stories about gods and giants and, you know, 8-legged horses and stuff like that. Because there's no source, it can't be in the fantasy section, but books that are based off it, like The Witch's Heart I just finished reading, that's in the fantasy section. Otherwise I wouldn't have bought it because I wouldn't have seen it because that's all I'm going for. But yeah, I want to break down why someone like me, Luka and Rubar, why we are more drawn to these stories. Rubar, you spoke to it a little bit earlier about, you know, the characters feeling real in something as zany and whimsical and magical and fantastical as something like the Avatar. Well, why is it that I feel more resonance in these characters from fantasy worlds than I do in fictional stories? So before I hand this off to you guys, there's an author called Stephen R. Donaldson, I believe. He did this book series called The Unbeliever, but he also wrote an article on epic fantasy in the modern world. And he says, the difference between fantasy and mainstream fiction is that in fantasy, the world is a manifestation of the character's internal conflict. So that's a pretty heady statement. The world around them is sort of symbolic and metaphoric to what they're actually dealing with, what the story's about. Whereas in mainstream fiction, the characters are a manifestation of the world, meaning the author has something to say about the real world we live in, and they've created these characters to help them represent that. Whereas fantasy, the world exists so that this character can tell a story through it, or these characters can tell a story through it. And the author can still, you know, say something about our real world, but not as directly as, hey, capitalism sucks. You know, but we can do that. We can have that same statement occurring in a fantasy, but it doesn't have to be our capital system. It doesn't have to be, you know, Wall Street. It can be something totally different. So I just dropped a lot on you guys, but we'll start with you, Rubar. Initially, like hearing all of this, what are your thoughts? Why are you, I guess we'll ask this first. Why are you more drawn to fantasy than to fiction?
I almost feel like it almost sets itself off from human emotion, and it taps into like whoever tweeted that, was it Taleb, was it like it
so yeah, it was Sean.
Yeah, I was like the animes, the fantasies and all of that. I think it taps into a personality that we have deeper inside, like the tweet said, like it's part of our soul. It's not part of our personality. Like I think we could resonate better with the fantasy part, because anytime we're challenged with situations that aren't in our favor, we tap into this fantasy world that we have created for ourselves. Like anytime like I'm like in a bad mood or something, my mind generally goes to like a game I used to play, like MapleStory, or like, you know, like RuneScape, or like it almost detaches me from human emotions and taps me into like a fantasy world where I'm like, okay, like it's easier to be dealt with. Like, for example, look at Luca's background compared to mine. Like, it's like I'd rather live in a place that looks like this than that. You know, like something a bit more like jolliest, something a bit more giving to that positive thought, to that happy thought. And then obviously, I think it's easier to imagine these characters as ourselves when there's no other human face to it. And like, if somebody else is going, if you could put a face to these people going through all these emotions and stuff, it's them dealing with it and not you. Whereas like I could imagine myself, let's say, for example, as a cartoon character way more than a real person that's going through it. So like in a real movie and stuff, how often are you like, oh, I'm this character, I'm that character? Not as often as you would in like a cartoon or an anime or a fantasy scenario where you're like, oh, I'm Aragorn, or like, you know, I'm Aang, I'm Sokka. I don't know. That's kind of my take on it. I think
so. A lot of those were sort of things I hadn't thought about before. Obviously, you spoke to like towards escapism, and that like it's easier to deal with things if you escape to a whimsical place, a la Avatar or whatever the case may be. But also, like when we're talking about like a real world movie, let's say, versus something like an animated Disney film that has little blob people. It's sort of easier to resonate with the blob people because they're not real and they're talking about human emotions and human issues. But when you look at like a real person that a story might be based off, you have to also account for how you yourself would feel towards that person, regardless of their situation, right? Because
like it comes with a bit of judgment towards a different human being. Whereas like towards like an anime character or like a fantasy thing, it's like, oh, like these people, these aren't real people, but like I could still like
they're very like archetypal characters, right? Like a Naruto, we know like, oh, he's been through a lot of sad things, and you know, in spite of that, he's sort of risen above. Whereas when we look at like a real world story, something maybe like, let's say, for example, like Rocky or Creed or like Warrior or something, we look at these people and we go, oh, you scumbag, how could you do that to the people you love? And it's sort of harder to root for them by the end of it, because it's like it's less it's more of a gray area, I guess. And there is obviously morality within fantasies. Obviously, like the Lord of the Rings is purely like morality, but with Lord of the Rings, it really is a little bit like black and white. We only really get a few gray characters, like maybe the Steward of Gondor, who are like you sort of have to look at a human level. Everything else is like, oh, orc bad, you know, Sauron bad, elves, humans good, hobbits good. But with a story where you're dealing with real people, like real humans, it's sort of like I have to see where all these people are coming from, and
like what, like the reasoning behind everything, and like,
and I wouldn't like this person in real life, even if they are the good guy. They're fucking annoying. Stop singing every goddamn time you have a problem.
Like the fucking nomads in the Airbender. Like if that was a group of real people, I'd be like, yo, these guys
shut
are
the
fucking
fuck
weird.
up.
These guys are weirdos, you know, like. And then these guys come in, I'm just laughing. I'm like, yo, like, I'd love to join them and just walk around this fake forest and just fucking sing to people and shit like that.
Luca, what about you?
No, I totally agree with you guys that it's easier to relate to something that's so far out there versus something that's realistic like that. But it's interesting that you guys mentioned that, because so much of modern fantasy is very realistic in the character work, and most characters are in a gray area. Like just the Bone Shard daughter is a very, like, the character, like, despite the fact that who the characters are, like the reveal we get about them at the end, like their emotions are very real and relatable, and like you get a bit of that, like, oh, I don't like this character because of their personality. But for me, one of the biggest things is like world building is huge, because like in Rocky, like Philadelphia, like, okay, like that's the setting. Like, to me, setting is such an important thing in a story you're reading. Like, just looking at my background, it looks really cool. It's like a really aesthetically pleasing like thing to be described or like look at. It's like, it just, I guess that's more on the escapism side, like just being in a completely brand new world. And like, I mean, I love just like drinking in that, like, I love exposition and fantasy. Like, give me all the world building, like the details of a new culture and all that stuff. Like, I love all of those details. So like, that's one thing that you just don't get in normal fiction, like Anne of Green Gables and stuff like that. The stuff we used to read. Like, so from an escapism point of view, fantasy is much better. And then from a relatable point of like, there's no reason you can't explore all these like very real human issues and emotions through the lens of a fantasy story.
There's no way you can though, because it was all written by humans anyway. So it is real human emotions that are behind these characters. So
exactly. And you can even explore
now they've just had like added a fiction, a non-fictional like face to it or a character to it. So it's like, it's not a real person that you're judging. It's now you can imagine yourself as them almost easier.
Feel more related. I think on this podcast I've talked about the Spider-Man effect, right? Like, character who's masked, it's always easier for kids to see themselves as that character because, you know, their face is actually hidden by a mask. So they're more of like an enigma or like a figurehead type of thing. Whereas when you have a character like Superman, just white dude, very like, you know,
curly hair,
like very like normal looking white dude, it's harder for like kids who aren't that to be like, I could see myself as Superman. It's more like, oh, what a dude, and he's a weird dude,
he's a hero. That's never me, that's Superman.
He sort of comes from a place to him. Like a goody two shoes, he's sort of Wonder Bread type of superhero, right? Like not very, up until like recently, more recent iterations of Superman stories, has he been like a very complex, you know, three-dimensional character, whereas like his origins are very one-dimensional. I'm a good guy because good guys are good guys. And I think with people like Spider-Man, it's way easier to see yourself as that character because they're not really given a face at the moments where they are portraying heroic aspects of themselves. So I think that's pointing more towards like fantasy and science fiction as being like these things that everyone can sort of see themselves in, regardless of station in real life. Whereas fiction, like you're saying, Luka, the rules of a fantasy world are given to us or, you know, revealed to us as we read or as we consume the fantasy. But with fiction that takes place in our world, we know the rules of the world already, at least in some, you know, different varying levels. So, you know, when people work outside of those rules, that doesn't usually happen in those sort of stories. It's a fictional person who's being put into a situation that could or could not be real, but hypothetically could happen. Whereas in fantasy, it's like, don't go in the forest, because if you go into the forest on a Wednesday and the sun's up, well, then you transform into a rabbit and now you're stuck as a rabbit. Whereas like that would never fucking happen in the real world, but that could serve as a metaphor for something that can be represented in our real world. I think it's sort of easier to see yourself in that situation than being like, well, you could be a New York woman who's trying to make her way in the fashion industry. It's like, I'm not though. So it's tough for me to like, you know?
Yeah, you're totally right. And like the fantasy element makes it almost easier to see yourself in the shoes of a character who you're not like demographically the same as.
Right.
Like, I think this is it works better through books than visual media because you see what the character looks like. Like when you're reading, for example, The Rage of Dragons, like all the characters are black. Yeah. And like I can relate with Tao very easily. Like there's no barrier there between me not being black and him being black. Like that's not an issue. Or like Misaki in The Sword of Kaigen. Like I'm not a woman or a mother, but like I can very much like empathize and relate to her like story and her journey. And I think the fact that it's a fantastical setting just sort of makes it easier to blend like those experiences somehow. Like it just takes a bit away from like the demographic.
If you can believe there'll be dragons in the story, you could also believe that you can emotionally resonate with a woman.
Exactly.
It's not which I should say in fiction that shouldn't be the thing. Like we're not very narrow-minded in that way.
No, yeah, it's not about that, but it's like for example, you see a movie about like, I don't know, The Devil Wears Prada or something like that. It's like sure, I can watch that, but like it won't resonate with me in the same way that like The Sword of Kaigen did, like Misaki's actual story in The Sword of Kaigen. Right. Like it just doesn't have that same impact. Maybe I'm wrong. Like maybe it's not the fact that it's fiction versus fantasy, but I think that like the entirely brand new world and setting and like all those fantastical elements just make it easier to immerse yourself in the world and forget about what's holding you back from relating to certain characters.
Yeah, that's
it's almost like a brand new, like what's it called? We always, like, how often do we wish we go back into the medieval times and like solve things with sword fighting and like I think a lot of my attraction to fantasy is like it's always in a different timeline than we're in, like with all the technology. Like I personally hate like even Korra, the Legend of Korra.
Oh wow, interesting.
Was completely different for me than Avatar, than the last Airbender, because the timeline was like Korra was like almost like in our time right now. Mm-hmm. You know, like close with all the technology, and like it wasn't anything in my fantasy that I'd tap into and be like, oh, like medieval times, people fighting with boomerangs and like, you know, whereas the last Airbender,
I have that same thing too. When I see like cell phones in a fantasy setting, I'm like, what do you need the crows for? Like, what do you need the pigeons? Like, you know?
Yeah. I think that's what I resonate with the most. It's like when these fantasies go into times that I thought about living in and like being like, oh, I wish we did have sword fighting, and like I wanted to be the best swordsman in town and be the hero, and you know, like, so to me, if it's in our timeline of right now and like with cell phones and with the technology that we have, it almost isn't as fantasy like for me as like something in a different timeline. Like, but don't get me wrong, like Dragon Ball Z has cell phones and stuff, and it's like very modern and like it almost looks like it's
futuristic even
in Japan and stuff. Yeah, but I don't know. I think even the way the cartoon is represented is what taps us into fantasies. Because like, for example, Korra, it's so real life, like very, very like a lot of, even the way like objects are made, it's like very real life. Whereas like Dragon Ball Z, like the cars have different sized tires and like, you know, like it's gooey and it's not as serious. And I think that's what taps me into that setting more. And I'm just like, oh, like this is, I'd much rather live in the Dragon Ball Z world than
I'd say Dragon Ball Z is even more so like it's science fiction more than fantasy at all, right? Because it's the powers aren't necessarily like magic from the universe. It's like these beings from a different planet. It's all sort of like willpower based. And I guess like there is chi or whatever in Dragon Ball, but it's like it's not really the focus.
No.
I also wanted to say too, like I want to talk a little bit about like what makes fantasy and science fiction the same, because I do believe they're the same thing in just a different filter.
Time period, pretty much.
But I also want to talk like my sort of hesitance towards fiction also comes from like I don't want to constantly be depressing myself in the real world. Like, so if there's a sad story, like something like Sword of Kaigen, Luka, that's very heavy and, you know, created such an emotional response for me that was like very real and made me think of like people I know and situations I've been in and like resonated that way in a very, very heavy and real way. That came from a fantasy story, but I would never read the same exact story if you took all those fantasy elements out, because then for me, it's too real. I've said this to my girlfriend like 100 times. Like there's certain movies I just like don't want to watch. So I'm like, it's too real and it's not actually real. This isn't a historic thing that happened. So like those things are.
But it's like you're actually put into that situation. Like you're dealing with real people going through these real things.
Yeah.
Whereas like in the fantasy world, it's like deep down, you know, a part of it is fake, so you're
Well,
not as.
It's that, but it's also like when there's like a fictional story versus like a non-fictional story, right? I'm more drawn to the non-fiction one because it's like I feel like I have a responsibility to consume that, the non-fiction, because that's something that's real that happened, and we should be aware of those things, especially if they deal with like atrocities or injustice or anything like that. Like I feel like that's important to know, but to have that in a fictional character or a fictional sort of world
It's
that
not
takes
directly
place in our world, it just feels to me like sort of like trauma baiting. Like you want to be sad about something, here's something that could happen. It's just like makes me anxious. Whereas like if it's in a fantasy, it feels more earned, because it's like not only did you have to get me to believe in this world, believe that these characters would exist in this world, but now you're getting me to believe that they're dealing with some really, really emotional, like heavy stuff. And on all three levels, you've sort of hooked me in and got my attention. Whereas a fictional story that takes place in our world, where those same themes come up, it just sort of feels like, you haven't really earned my attention in that same way, because it's like, those are,
you just took a setting that I literally live in right now.
It's like, what would you do if this terrible thing happened to you? Like that would fucking suck. But like, I don't want to think about that all the time. Like,
no, that's fair. But like, and even I have a different way of approaching, like I said, like timelines, like stuff that happened in the 80s or the early 1800s or the 1900s. I could watch easier because it's not in our timeline, and it almost is like a fantasy world to me. Like The Imitation Game, like they go into like homophobia and like, like depression, and like it is very emotional, but it's so much easier for me to watch because it's in a whole different timeline. It's
still a bit of escapism. It's not,
slightly. I mean, it's only 80 years ago, so it is pretty recent, but it's not fully related to me right now. It's like I have to tap into a past that I never was a part of.
Right.
So like, especially if it's like in our generation stuff, I'm like, oh, like Love, Simon, I believe was one of the movies. And I was just like, yo, like this could be like, this is thousands of people going through it right now. And like, it hits you harder because you're like, holy fuck, like this is real.
Yeah.
Whereas like something that's happened in the past, it is still real. Like, don't get me wrong. It's just as relevant, but it's easier to take that information in without having your emotions take over.
Right. Yeah, and it's sort of like the example I wanted to bring up was like Hidden Figures, right? Where it's like that is a true story that happened, and like the three of us, like I think all of our mothers are like immigrants, so like we're all sons of immigrant women, so like that's a story that I could sort of it's non-fictional, told in like a heightened sort of reality adaptation of what really happened, but that's sort of more something I could resonate with, because there's people in my life, obviously like my family and extended family, who I see as those women in that movie. Whereas like if it's something that doesn't really call to my real world experience, I'm less likely to like enjoy it, relate to it, or even like want to force my like emotions to come out because like as a result of it. Love, Simon's another good example where it's like, like I know that experience from people that I love and know, where it's like I can hear that firsthand. And so like to see it play out in the way that's like non-traditional as far as mainstream media goes is really cool. And things like Shang-Chi and stuff, Black Panther, are like these really pivotal moments culturally, not just because like they're fantastical films, but because what they mean in the real world. And Love, Simon, I think would fit in that same sort of category, as would like Crazy Rich Asians, where it's like, even though they're not films I'd be interested in premise alone, I'm interested because of like the cultural impact they have.
The
whereas like those are
relativity to your life.
But again, like if we took like the story of Lord of the Rings and put it in modern times, I'm like, fuck off. I wouldn't care at all.
No. It's, I mean, I think a lot of that comes from escapism though. Like you try to tap into a different timeline and a different world that could have been, or that you fantasize about, and like
Right.
it definitely takes you away from the reality of things. I think that's why I mean, personally, us, like people like us, I think like tapping into that, because it's a whole new experience compared to what real life is like, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I think setting is huge. And Rubar, you mentioning like Avatar, Korra versus Avatar, like they feel very, very different.
yeah,
Like Korra didn't feel like Avatar. I loved Korra, but I like Avatar more. Like the feeling of that like low technology sort of completely like
raw,
separated. Yeah, exactly. Raw. It was like different from our world. Just I don't know if it's like it gives you the distance to like disconnect from it enough to just like immerse yourself completely in it without having to overthink like about like the details. Like I also don't like technology in fantasy. I don't know, Rubar, have you seen Hunter x Hunter?
No.
Okay. So that's another one that is like it's fantasy, but then like you see like technology. They have cell phones, they have cars, they have like modern technology.
Right.
But like it doesn't take away from it because it's also done in a fantastical way. Well, not like the cars, but like for example, their phones are like they're shaped like giant beetles, and like they don't use it in the way we use it and that kind of stuff. So
no, yeah, I think it's not even so much to tap into what we have, and like it's more so like tapping into something that we're not used to. If their movements are the same, and like their objects and like their technology is exactly the same, it's like, am I tapping into something unfamiliar? No, it's like you're literally like just restating what my real life is like, just in somebody else's like point of view kind of thing. Whereas like even like a simple thing like a cell phone shape, or like, you know, like even certain ways that cars are shaped or buildings or whatever, you're like, holy shit, like even, have you guys seen Ready Player One?
Right. Yeah.
Like even that, like that could literally be in this it could be 2021 in that movie right now. But it's so out of the ordinary where you're like, holy shit, like this is so cool. Like
yeah, see that one definitely more like science fiction in the way that this is theoretical, this could exist in our real world. Currently it doesn't though, and I think that's sort of the distinction there between like science fiction and fantasy. So fantasy is a completely new world. Science fiction is like theoretically this could take place in this world.
But even I think even then it's like cooler to tap into, because it's like it could be here, but it's not. So like it is still a getaway from reality to watch certain things like that, right? So,
and going back to like Avatar and Korra, like I can definitely see what you guys are saying in that Avatar definitely feels more like a fantasy because such low technology, and the technology that we do see is very much based off the magic system that is the fantastical aspect. But for Korra, I think it was interesting in that, like, I think I would say like it's easier for me to go back to Avatar because again, it's more whimsical, and like going there is definitely an escape and it feels like a nice warm hug. Whereas Korra, to me, the themes and sort of the messages they're trying to get across in that show definitely more mature, and to me feels like a real world progression of how the Avatar world could theoretically play out. So it's almost like science fiction within fantasy, which I do like, and I think it opens the door for more storytelling. I think if we had like if Korra was just another Avatar, I think we would just get into the same type of stories. Why balance is important, things like that. But with Korra, as we see like the divide between different types of people based off class and technological advancement, I think it's more interesting concepts we can or questions we can ask based off like, you know, natural ability versus technology, which, you know, the human condition is sort of boiled down to. So yeah, I think that's interesting. I want you guys though, what, Rubar, would you say is your like biggest difference between science fiction and fantasy? Not so much as setting, but like, what do you think are the differences between them on like a very broad level?
I think like you were saying, I think fantasy is a lot more open to me. It's really where your thought and your mind takes you. Whereas science fiction, it's like it's usually based on something familiar and something that we've all seen that we could relate to, kind of thing. So I think science fiction is based on certain things we have, but advanced or enhanced or like certain like changed in certain ways. Whereas fantasy, you could have a little mushroom fucking like thing talking to you, like, and it would make total sense at the time where you're in this like fantasy world of yours. But thinking about it in your human form, it's like, holy shit, like that would never actually happen. Whereas science fiction, it's like, oh, here's a spaceship, but it flies on water, you know, like it uses water as fuel, or like here are little robot things that could literally carry your groceries upstairs and whatever, you know. Like I think it's more related to like real life stuff. I think science fiction takes what we have right now and changes it a bit, so it's not real to us, but still based on something that we've seen. Whereas fantasy, you could tap into literally anything and everything at any time, kind of thing. So I think that's the biggest difference. It's like, and like science fiction, it's typically fantasy is typically like subjective to each person. So like your fantasy is going to be completely different than mine, and so is Luca's, you know. Like when we tap into our fantasy world, it's like, holy shit, like they're completely different, but as outrageous as we would think, kind of thing, right? Whereas science fiction, like,
sorry, go ahead.
Whereas like I think if I tapped into your science fiction mind, I'd be like, okay, like that's definitely something I would have also thought of, you know, like,
oh, okay.
Like it's not very different of what I would imagine science fiction being. Whereas fantasy, it's like, holy fuck, Matt thinks about this.
Yeah, it's sort of like the difference, like between like say like Luca and I's D&D campaign worlds, very different, but there are similar threads. Again, I think it goes back to that earlier quote, like fantasy, the world is a manifestation of the character's internal conflicts, right? Whereas like Luca, you would put things that are more you know, whether you were conscious or not of it, there's things in your fantasy world that only you would put there in that sort of way, because, you know, obviously we're all unique and different, but that's sort of who you are. Like your personality is coming through in the way you choose to tell stories and the settings you choose to make. And then the same could be said for, you know, Rubar, the way you make your characters, or the way I make my campaign world that's all coming from our imagination, but has a part of us in it that's truly unique and would not show up in anywhere else, type of thing, like you're saying.
Like even looking at the terminology, like science fiction just takes fiction and like kind of modifies it to make it cooler. Whereas fantasy, it's like you could think of something that nobody's ever thought of, and like, you know,
that's my thing too, though. That's why I don't think they're too dissimilar, is that in fantasy you get bending, say, like, and for a lot of people, if that's like their first introduction to like elemental based magic, that's very unique, right? But in science fiction, you just make up some sort of device that channels your inner soul and lets you make fire with the wrist gauntlet, right? It's like they're both doing the same things. They're introducing new worlds, whether that's planets or a fantasy based world that has, you know, sprawling continents or whatever the case may be. And then they're introducing a magic system, which, like, you know, in fantasy could be something like bending, and science fiction could be something like mech robots that you can pilot that are giant, you know. They're still introducing a new thing to tell the same type of stories. They just have a different lens on them. That's my sort of interpretation. But Luca, what's yours?
To me, sci-fi is under the umbrella of fantasy. Like fantasy is the encompassing, I don't want to say genre, because it's I don't know if it's a genre per se. It's more of a lens, or like a narrative lens, but like sci-fi is, I've actually had this debate with Ochi, who we are all friends with. He very much disagrees with what I'm about to say. Like, to me, all the like sci-fi is purely technology based, advanced technology, nothing else. Like that's what sci-fi is. As soon as you're talking about a different planet, as soon as you're talking about like any kind of abilities, like technology that channels your inner energy, that's fantasy. Like that's not sci-fi anymore. Like that's fantasy. Like until you like, while you're explaining things like terraforming planets, that's a sci-fi element in a fantasy world. Like to me, sci-fi is purely technology based. Anything that goes beyond the capabilities of technology, it becomes fantasy. Now where the lines blurs when you're talking about like technology so advanced that it's essentially magical, then it's like, okay, what is this? But that's still like, as soon as you're crossing that line of like, this kind of seems beyond just like computer abilities, it kind of falls into fantasy.
Yeah.
And
I think science
agree,
fiction.
but I think the line there is so thin. Like for me, like there's even a quote I think in the first like Marvel Thor movie where he's explaining to Jane like what we call science, you guys call magic.
Yeah.
It's just our technology is so advanced that like for you this just looks like two things floating in the air, but on us it's working on some like wild level that you couldn't comprehend, you silly earthling. But like for me that's what science fiction is, because these things could theoretically exist, but then again so could someone who's able to channel lightning into their fist. That could theoretically happen. I don't know how. I'm not a scientist, but I'm not a scientist, so I can't also tell you how a fucking giant Gundam would work either. Like, but I can imagine if you could make cars and you could make cranes, you could put that all together somehow.
That was,
make it.
and yeah, that was kind of my point about like science fiction. Like it actually takes stuff that we have right now, that we have in our today's world, and just like enhances them to levels that we can't imagine being real at this time. But it's definitely something that we could see happening in the future. Whereas like fantasy, it's like you could literally tap into anything and everything and be like yeah, I could just start bending water with my hands and like move the ocean around, you know. Like it's definitely, I think fantasy definitely has a broader thought process, whereas like science fiction goes based on what we're familiar with and just enhances it.
And like science fiction is much more grounded in reality, and like sort of the further you push that, the closer it gets to fantasy.
Yeah.
Like I think like what if you push sci-fi to its limits, it just becomes futuristic fantasy.
Exactly. Yeah. That's sort of a more concise way of saying giant robots with cranes and cars. Right? What the fuck is going on about? But yeah, again, I think like a fantasy world starts off as, okay, I want to tell a story of humans in some sort of form or fashion, but maybe your humans are represented as goblins or elves. And then you introduce the magic system, or, you know, the pantheon, which changes the world. Even if it's a different geographical world or a different planet, it changes what we know of human history, because now you're introducing an element that was never there before. I think science fiction is the exact same thing. It's like, yes, this is our current planet, but now we're introducing this fictional thing that doesn't currently exist, but technically could, right? And you're introducing that into the world. So let's say it's like replicants from Blade Runner, like put that, or put flying cars in, and now everything changes. Whereas like for fantasy, you could just as easily say there could be a way in the process of human evolution that we did develop bending powers. I bet in some simulation of humankind, that is at least once out of the 14 million or whatever, that probably could have happened. Right. Yeah, and I don't think there's too much difference there. I agree with you, Luka. It's like as soon as you push that too far, or if you scale fantasy back enough where it can be boiled down to a single contribution, they're pretty much the same. We're just taking what we know of humanity and the human condition, and we're adding an element that can't currently exist as far as we know, and then the story changes, and then you write sort of what the repercussions of that would be.
I mean, definitely, yeah. It definitely taps into something that, like, whether it's fantasy or science fiction, it's definitely something that we don't see in today's world, and that's why it's so cool to like tap into those things. It's like, holy fuck, like there's this fake world that we think is so cool, and like that almost everybody has thought of, you know, like, and it, especially like turning it into a movie or something, and you're like, holy shit, like even like Transformers, something that simple, you're like, oh my gosh, like.
Okay, can I quickly ask, Luka, what would you consider Transformers then? Because that takes place on a different planet with a different species.
Mm-hmm.
Would you call that fantasy then?
I mean, see, that's one of those that I would say that's a blend. Like, you have like the super advanced technology, but it's like Transformers are sentient creatures. So it's like that. It's honestly like the blend of both. Like,
but
Star Wars to me is
well
much more fantasy than it is sci-fi.
100%, I agree.
Whereas Star Trek is much more sci-fi, and it has some, I mean, I haven't seen a lot of Star Trek, but it has some fantastical elements like alien creatures and different planets stuff, but it's more grounded in the like advanced technology, advanced science, and that kind of stuff.
Right.
Blade Runner 2 is much more sci-fi. It's very much sci-fi, and it's like what makes the world different is the super advanced technology that exists. Whereas like there is a lot of sci-fi that has psychic abilities, like that's sort of where it goes oftentimes, and it's like explained in a way where it's like humans have figured out how to, like, I don't know, channel their brainwaves and match frequencies of brainwaves, and they can like start reading other people's minds. Like that's a very common theme in sci-fi, and like that sounds fantastical, and they just explain it in like a there's a machine that you can like put on your brain, on your head, and it like taps into your brain frequency, and it can like match the frequency of other people around you, and you can like read their minds, that kind of stuff.
Right.
So like sci-fi is very much based in technology, whereas fantasy is everything beyond it.
Right. Well, I typically, like, when I hear the difference between sci-fi and fantasy, like, or even if I try to think about it, like typically with sci-fi I think into the future, whereas fantasy I take myself back to the past.
Totally.
Like what could have been is fantasy. What technology is turning into is more of like a scientific faction.
Yeah.
I think the one rule to go off of would be like, if you could put a spaceship in it and it still remains the same, then it's fantasy, right? If we put a spaceship into the Hobbit, it would still be the Hobbit. Like, it doesn't change it. Like, you could have a magical space thing, and they essentially do, like with the ship they take into the Undying Lands. That's like a vessel they're using to travel between lands, a la the Rainbow Bridge or the Bifrost Bridge. Whereas if you put magic into it, does it become a fantasy? Then it's science fiction. If you put any sort of magic system into Blade Runner, it's no longer science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Any element of magic sort of changes it, unless you can explain it, like you're saying, Luka, via brainwave science and blah, blah, blah. But then again, at that point, it might as well be fantasy, because that's almost like not theoretically possible. Anybody have any closing thoughts on fantasy versus fiction?
Fantasy is
personally like fantasy way more, to be honest. I think tapping into, because like I think fantasy has more science fiction built into it, whereas science fiction is just more science fiction. So like, yeah, I think fantasy definitely gives you a broader thought process and like a bigger world to tap into, whereas science fiction, it's, like I said, typically based on stuff that we have right now, just enhanced to levels that we can't imagine right now.
Yeah, I agree. I've always been fantasy over sci-fi. And sci-fi fantasy over fiction as well. I think sci-fi fantasy allows for a lot more creativity, and the writing process allows like just more, it's more exciting to read, especially if I'm going to take the time also to read or listen to a book. I'd much rather listen to something extremely unique and like fantastical, imaginative and creative, rather than something that's based in our world.
Yeah, somebody else's life that doesn't actually exist.
Exactly.
Like going back to like me comparing my fantasy compared to Matt's, like if Luka had the option to look into both of our fantasy worlds, he'd be like, what the fuck is going on?
Whereas like that would be much more interesting than just watching a day in our life.
Yeah,
exactly.
Or like being our therapist for a day. You'd be like,
yeah, exactly.
I'm trying to I'm looking at my bookshelf and there's not one fictional book on the shelf. Or no, that's a nonfiction book. And the only ones I can remember reading I read in school.
Yeah.
A Thousand Splendid Suns, The Hatchet, Holes, stuff like that. And like such a slog to get through, even if they were interesting stories. A Thousand Splendid Suns is like a really great novel, but like I can't reread it. It's fucking sad. And I know things like that actually did happen to people. So I don't want to put myself through it. I like knowing that is enough for me to like be aware of it and go through my life and know that those things happen. I don't want to re-immerse myself in the sadness of real world atrocities. But when it's a fantasy thing, it's like I'm so far removed because it's not a real thing. The whole world isn't even real. That like I can just resonate with the characters and not be only like upset about it like within reason, knowing that it's not real type of thing.
I kind of have that with horror movies. Like I don't like watching horror movies that actually take time in our in us right now. Like whereas like I could watch like Child's Play and be perfectly fine with it because
Wow.
Like it is a bit more fantasy and it is a bit less realistic to like watch. So it actually doesn't scare me as much as like what a real movie would do, or something with just humans kind of thing.
Yeah,
I've always
I agree. Like I usually like hate horror movies, but like if it's something like Aliens. Oh, we lost Luca there for a second.
Oh, we did.
Something like Aliens, I'm like, that's okay for me because like it's science fiction horror. It's not just like some deranged person murdering people. That's too real. I don't
like
want
Paranormal Activity.
myself.
Never seen it.
Really?
Not interested. Zero. Like whereas like like something out of the ordinary. It's like like for example, Stranger Things. I know it's not really horror, but I mean kind of, but like something out of the ordinary happening and like fantasies or science fiction coming into play. It's like like that's a bit easier to watch compared to like something like Paranormal Activity where somebody being possessed is also like very real in our world. So definitely is easier to I don't know, like you said, like it's like relating it to our real life, it almost makes it shitty to watch. Like you're after the movie, you're gonna think about people that you've like kind of experienced the same things with. You're like,
exactly, yeah. Horror is one that like I forgot to bring up, but definitely like when it's too real, I'm totally checked out because now I'm gonna be anxious about it. But when it's something so far fetched like Aliens or something, it's like I can remove myself enough from that situation to be like, I will never have to deal with this. So this is fine to consume in this way because this will be a unique experience. But I don't want to think about Paranormal Activity anytime I'm home alone. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, I think that'll wrap our conversation on fiction versus fantasy. Rubar, thanks for coming on the show and chatting with us.
Yeah, man. Come through again.
Thanks for having me. I know I couldn't add too much to this conversation.
Oh no, you're great, man.
I don't watch and read as much as you guys in that aspect, but
no, you got the nerdy vibes.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on here, and I definitely always watch your guys' stuff on Instagram and stuff, and I'm like, oh, I wish I had more time so I could just join every time. But no, it's great to be here and love the conversations here. Like I said earlier, like I don't typically tap into this part of my life because I'm typically just talking about engineering and stuff with a bunch of middle-aged white men. So this is definitely a good escape.
Yeah, you get to escapism into escapism. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, but we are the Lords of Lore, but that doesn't mean we gatekeep people's enjoyment of fantasy. So anyone's welcome.
Never.
We are benevolent leaders of lore.
Facts.
But yeah. So don't forget, last Friday episode of Pokemon Unabashed. Remember this Friday we're playing some D&D, and the book of the month is Ninth House. This show comes out every Tuesday. You can check it out here, and every Friday we have some sort of thing, whether it's D&D, a book review, or an interview with somebody who is super passionate about something. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel. If you're on Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star review. If you're on any sort of app that lets you do some sort of review, leave said review, and we will read it out at the top of the show. So if you want to be part of the podcast in that way, that is how you can do so. Thanks everybody for watching. As always, I am Matt.
I'm Luka.
I am Rubar.
And we are the Lords of Lore.
Take care.